All right, so to kickstart our unit on the Civil War, this first lecture is going to be looking at the cotton economy and slavery and why cotton was so important to the South, as well as how cotton and slavery together is going to create this divide between the North and the South leading up to the Civil War. So slavery pre-independence. Before 1776 and before America declared independence from Britain, slavery did exist across all 13 colonies. However, slavery was going to play a much more important role in the South compared to the North, and this is because Southern climate was way more suitable for plantation agriculture. So we have our important cash crops like cotton. Cotton is going to do a lot better in the South because it's more humid. We don't want cotton growing in the cold. It's not going to survive as well or be harvested as efficiently, and so crops like cotton are going to do much better in the South. We'll also see that the Quakers and other radical Protestants are going to start condemning slavery as an immoral evil. And this is because we'll have the Quakers start to compare the ideas of slavery with the ideas of enlightenment, so the idea of equality, and saying that in slavery, one human being owning and having control over another human being is not a great example of equality. So this is an important step in saying that at this point in time, at least in the North, we're starting to view African Americans as human beings instead of as property or as a labor force. So we'll see that after we declare independence, the North is going to abolish slavery. And we'll see, as shown in this map, this blue color is going to show the earliest states to abolish slavery. So again, right after we declare independence, we have most of our northern states on the side of abolition. All of our southern states, however, they're only going to abolish slavery after the Civil War. So this happens in the 1860s, almost an entire century after the North starts to abolish slavery. One more important thing to note is that after we declare independence, Congress is also going to pass an ordinance or a law that is going to prohibit slavery from moving out west in the North. So as Americans are able to move out west, Congress is going to say, awesome, you can move out west, however, no slaves can go with you. And that's at least going to be true for the northern part of the country at this time. So beginning to look into why was the South so committed to slavery and why was the South not also viewing slaves as human beings? Why are we still looking to them as just property and just a labor force? And the short answer is that slavery is going to become an important part of Southern economy. And so because they're making us this money, we don't want to give them their freedom. We need them to keep our economy going. And we'll also see that the founding fathers, they're not going to be willing to directly tamper or directly deal with slavery and the issue of slavery in the South. So the founding fathers are going to avoid using the word slave in documents such as the Declaration or the new Constitution. However, they are going to acknowledge that slavery did exist and did go on in the South at the time. So we'll see one major example of this is going to be the Three-Fifths Compromise. And this was a way to appease the South and to make the South happy in order for the Southern states to ratify the new Constitution that would be replacing the Articles of Confederation. So we'll see that the South were not ready to admit that slaves were people. Slaves were only property. However, they did want this property to count towards their population. So we'll see that we have our white dude over here, who is of course going to represent one full human being in the population count. And then we have his slave over here, who is only going to be 3/5 of a person. And so we'll have one slave be 3/5, another slave be 3/5, and over time that will add up. It will get you some more whole numbers towards your population, which will of course make the South happy and will get them on the side of ratifying the new Constitution. So looking into why was cotton so important, because we know that the South was harvesting and exporting other crops at the time. So why was cotton the standout crop? And we'll see that it wasn't necessarily the standout crop until 1783 with Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin. And the cotton gin was really influential because it allowed for faster harvesting of the cotton crop. So the cotton gin was able to separate the cotton from the seed very fast and very efficiently. And because of this, we're able to start producing cotton a lot faster, and we're able to export it a lot faster as well. And so looking at some numbers over here, in 1790, slaves were able to produce 9,000 bales of cotton. This is right after the invention of the cotton gin. And then just 40 years later, in 1830, that number skyrockets and slaves are able to produce 2 million bales of cotton. So really fast, cotton is going to become 50% of all US exports, and a large portion of this is going to go over to Britain for textile work and for making clothes with the cotton the US produces. So again, over here, just a visual representation. We see in just a span of 40 to 50 years, we're able to exponentially get the number of bales up. So again, cotton is going to be very important to sustaining the Southern economy. So over here we have a picture of the cotton gin. So what you'll do is you'll feed the cotton through one end. It'll go through this machine right here. You'll use the crank to actually separate the seed from the cotton, and as a result you will get the cotton nice and separated right here, ready to be shipped off to Britain. So we'll see that as cotton production starts to expand, because we can start harvesting the cotton a lot faster, cotton production is also going to move out westward. So planters and masters are going to take their cotton gins with them, they're going to take their slaves with them, and if they needed more slaves, then they can purchase some surplus stock or more slaves from the upper south. And so we'll see that cotton is important, and because it is important, we're going to need a large labor force to harvest the cotton. However, this labor force, they don't have to have any skills. They just have to be able to turn this crank, and that's all we need them for. So cotton and slavery are going to really start to become interlinked at this time in importance. So beginning to look at how many slaves worked with cotton, because again, we have other cash crops that are being harvested in the South. If we look at our map over here, we do see that the majority of slaves are going to work with cotton. If it's 50% of our exports and we need a large labor force to harvest the cotton, we're going to need, again, most of our slaves working on these fields. So we have 55% working with cotton. Our next biggest number is going to be our domestic slaves. So 15% of slaves who are not working in the field, but working in the house and with the masters. And the rest of our cash crops are pretty evenly split. We have rice, sugar, and hemp. Hemp would be used for rope making. We've got tobacco, and we've got some mining and construction industries as well. We'll also note that some slaves would have special skills. So if they were an artisan or a musician, then their masters could definitely rent them out to other masters for some additional money-making opportunities. Looking at what percentage of the population consists of slaves in terms of slaves versus whites or masters. In the year 1850, we see that we have 3.2 million slaves to 6.2 million whites in 15 other southern states. So the slave population is definitely starting to catch up to our white population. And we even see that we have more slaves than whites in South Carolina. One important thing to note about this divide in population is that not very many Southern whites own slaves. Only 10,000 families have slaves, and of this 10,000, only 3,000 families have 100 plus slaves. So we see that not a lot of people in the South had slaves, and if they did, they only had a small number of them. And these slaves were only working on small plantations. So slavery and the plantation agriculture, it wasn't vast, and it wasn't all across the South. Getting into some of the labor conditions. So again, on these less popular but large plantations, masters were often a figurehead. So if you have 100 plus slaves on a plantation, you might run into the master if you're getting punished. However, the master himself cannot personally oversee the work and the production of all slaves at all times, so he's majorly just a figurehead. On our smaller plantations, however, masters and slaves are able to have a closer relationship, whether this be good or bad. That master does have the choice of overseeing his slaves more closely. So slaves on smaller plantations are going to be supervised way closer than the slaves on larger plantations. One setback, in addition to being supervised closely or being punished more periodically than slaves on larger plantations, are on small plantations, there's no sense of a community. and that you're smaller in numbers, and so having that sense of community is not going to be as vast. Getting into some labor conditions on the fields. So slaves on the fields were organized into different groups based on their physical abilities, and all groups would be supervised by an overseer who was usually white, but also by a driver who was usually black. And the job of the driver would be to make sure that the slaves were working hard, getting their work done, making sure that they weren't falling behind, because if they were, then they of course could be punished. So again, the majority of the contact that slaves would have with their masters is if they were going to be punished. This could be by a whip or just by a beating, and it could be for falling behind, for working slow. They need to make sure that they're keeping up with production on the field. So more labor conditions. So we talk a lot about cotton and the importance of cotton in this lecture. However, we do think that slaves on the rice plantations probably had the worst conditions. And this is just because slaves on rice plantations had to build flood banks, because if one portion of the rice gets flooded, then the entire crop is just ruined. So some harsh conditions out there, although working with cotton is definitely still not an easy feat. We also recognize that house slaves, they generally had an easier life compared to field slaves, just in that they aren't exerting the same amount of physical labor. An interesting thing that we note is that slave society did tend to echo free society at the time. So we see that male slaves had a dominant role in the household, and they were also expected, again, to do a lot more of the physical labor. You want strong, healthy male slaves to do a lot of physical exertion out on the fields, and you want your female slaves to be your domestic slave. You want them in the house caring for the master's domestic chores, but on top of that, these female slaves would also have to go and do domestic chores for their own families back in the slave cabins. So getting into what the slave family actually looked like, most slaves lived in a two-parent family or a two-parent group back in the cabins, and slaves, they were able to get married, and a significant thing about the marriages was that they were often long-lasting and stable. Marriages were a great support system and a good person to lean on after the physical and mental exhaustion of working on the fields or even in the household of your master. We'll also see that any children who are orphaned due to a family member being killed or a family member being sold, they're going to be protected and be cared for by the slave community. So we do see extended families start to build within the slaves. And we'll see that as a result, this family and this sense of community is going to be one of the most powerful transmitters of slave culture. So getting into a little bit of slave culture, we'll see that music, stories, and religion is really going to hold the slaves together in a way to, again, just mentally unwind, just escape from the physical and mental exertion that's required of them every day from dusk until dawn on the field. It's a way, music is a good way to communicate and to protest. Storytelling is a good sense of community and a good sense of escape. And again, religion, holding on to your beliefs, your values, and your rituals, especially from your African culture, is going to help sustain you as well. We'll also see that simply sharing the same amount of work is going to bond our slaves together, so working on the fields is definitely going to build a sense of community and a sense of understanding between our slaves. So looking into how did slaves resist? We know that results were not very common. We have some slaves who attempted some revolts, one being in 1800, we have the revolt or the rebellion of Gabriel Prosser. His plan was to take the governor hostage. However, he was not successful in this. The Virginia authorities, they learned of his plan, they arrested him, they killed him, and killed 30 of his followers as well. In 1831, we have our only serious slave revolt, Nat Turner's rebellion, and in this rebellion, Nat Turner and 70 slaves were able to kill 55 whites, most of them being women and children. However, Turner, he was captured and executed along with 17 other slaves. So knowing that there was a possibility of slave revolt, we can also look into how did whites try to keep control over their slaves. So we see that some certain rules are going to be set up in place. One being that slaves were not allowed to leave their plantation without authorization, so they have to have a note from their master saying that they have permission to leave. Slaves were also not allowed to carry weapons for obvious reasons, and slaves were definitely not allowed to strike a white person. Just that idea of all-out control, you cannot fight against your master. And we'll see that militia patrols are going to be set up to enforce these slave codes. So whites in the local area would be required to make sure that slaves were following these rules, keeping that control. So looking into, was escape even a possibility for our slaves? So many slaves did find it difficult to escape their plantation. 95% of runaway slaves were male, and of this 95%, 75% were under 35. So again, the most likely slaves who were able to escape were male slaves in their prime. It's going to be difficult to escape if you have a family, just because you have to look after more than just yourself. There's multiple people you're trying to get across into the free, or into the north. So just a more difficult beat all around. And most of our runaways, they were caught and severely punished just to ensure that they did not escape or try to escape again. We'll see that an important factor, and one way that slaves were able to escape if they were successful, was using the Underground Railroad, which was a system of houses that was set up to allow slaves to make their way from the south up into the north. So looking into how did slaves escape using the Underground Railroad, we know that the railroad, it provided money, food, clothes, and advice for our runaway slaves. So again, just a safe haven, a place of refuge as they made their way up north out of the south and away from slavery. And we know that most of the slaves are going to escape from the upper south, just because going from the lower south, you have more land to get across, and it's going to be more difficult the farther you have to go to get to the north. One significant person that was involved in the Underground Railroad was, of course, Harriet Tubman. She escaped from slavery herself in 1849, and she returns to the South to help slaves escape using the Underground Railroad, and she's never caught. And as a result, she's able to help numerous amount of slaves out of slavery. So looking at, were there free blacks in the South? Was that a thing that was going on? And we do see that it was. In 1860, we see 260,000 free blacks are in the South. Some were able to purchase their freedom if they did have a special skill. So again, if they were an artisan or a musician, they could save up some of that money and purchase their freedom. However, many of these slaves who were free, or many free blacks in the South, they were mixed race, and they were given their freedom by their white father. So you have a white master who would have a baby with a slave, and then after the baby is born, the father says, I would like to give freedom to my son or my daughter. We do see that these free blacks were required to carry documentation that would prove their free status. If they did not have proof of their free status, then they risked being sold right back into slavery. However, free blacks in the South, they had no political rights. They had no special status. They had limited job opportunities, and as a result, few of them were able to be successful. So looking at free blacks in the North, we see 200,000 free blacks, some who did escape from slavery using the Underground Railroad. However, we do see that many Northerners were just as racially prejudiced as Southerners. So again, African Americans, they are free in the North, and we do see those connections with African Americans to humans compared to African Americans being just property in the South. However, we still have that idea of racism and of the racial superiority. So as a result, we do see segregation start to take place, and that separation that defines somebody being white, so of more importance, than somebody being black or being less important. But we will see that Northern politicians are going to start working together to expand black rights, but it will take some time for this to occur. So getting into the idea, is slavery, or was slavery, exploitation or paternalistic? We We know outright that slavery definitely exploited slaves, but we have an interesting outlook as far as looking into the idea of racism even after the abolition of slavery in discussing why did people think that African Americans needed white people? Why did we think that they were less than? Getting into these topics, we see that slaves, they were exploited just because slave owners, they had unlimited power. So these slaves, they're being ruled by fear and discipline, and again, this racism, that paternalistic idea that white masters tried to turn over to the slaves, saying that, well, the slaves, they need me, they need my guidance, they need me as that father figure because they're inferior. So again, just getting back into this weird power dynamic that allowed this exploitation. Slaves, again, they could be sold, they could be punished, sexually exploited, even killed without their masters facing consequences. So masters oftentimes just had full range to do with their slaves, do with their property as they pleased. And we'll see a range of some masters who were more harsh than others, but it was ultimately up to the master. We'll also see slaves are going to work under hard conditions. They work from dusk until dawn, and they're working to the fullest, to their full extent, but for the lowest cost. They're not compensated for anything. If you were going to be compensated, you had to have that special skill. However, it was not predominantly common. And again, any punishment was going to be firm and harsh. They'll have beatings, brandings, mutilations. So again, we see here a branding tool that would be used on slaves. We have this picture, a common one as a result of a slave being whipped. And again, just one quote that stands out: to spare the rod is to spoil the child. So we need to punish our slaves because if we don't, we're spoiling them. And really, they need to be punished because if they're working slow, they're not learning, they're not meeting our expectations. And again, just getting into how the slaves were exploited, how the slaves were mistreated. Slaves, they're living in overcrowded cabins. And of our marriages that are long lasting, a fourth of them are going to be broken up by forced separation. And this is because slaves could be inherited. So if one master dies, then he can leave his slaves off to another person. A slave can be given as a gift. A slave can be gambled or even sold to other masters. And again, the idea or the reality of manumission or the reality of a master freeing his slave is going to be very rare because, again, that slave is his property. There's no point in freeing your property because they're expensive property and you need them on your labor force. And I think that's where we'll end.